The reservation was for 7 o'clock, and by 7:23, Neil Hartwell was fairly certain he had been stood up. He didn't check his phone again. He had already checked it 4 times in the last 15 minutes, and the screen kept showing him the same thing. No new messages, no missed calls, just the original note from his sister Janet that said her name is Colette. "She's lovely, just try, Neil, please just try." And he had tried. He had driven 40 minutes in February sleet to get to this restaurant, had changed his shirt twice, had arrived 6 minutes early like some kind of anxious teenager, and now he was sitting at a corner table in Maple and Stone with a glass of water and a bread basket he hadn't touched, watching the door. The woman at the host stand had given him a sympathetic look twice already. That was how he knew it was getting embarrassing. Neil was 53 years old. He wore a gray wool sweater that his daughter Becca had once described as aggressively humble, and he drove a 2011 pickup truck with a cracked dashboard that he kept meaning to fix. He did not look like a man who owned 400 acres of timberland outside Huntsville, or who had quietly built one of the most respected conservation land trusts in Ontario over the past 2 decades. He looked like a man who fixed fences and went to bed early, which, most days, he also was. He had not wanted to come tonight. He had told Janet that he was fine, that 53 was not a number that required emergency intervention from one's younger sister, that Marianne had been gone for 3 years, and he was not, he had used this word deliberately, lonely. He was private. There was a difference. Janet had not agreed with that distinction. So here he was, waiting. He reached for the bread basket, then didn't take anything from it, then pushed it slightly to one side, then looked at the door again. A woman in a dark green coat was struggling with an umbrella that had turned inside out in the wind. She stepped through the entrance, laughed quietly at the umbrella, collapsed it, and then looked up and scanned the room with the particular expression of someone searching for a stranger's face. Their eyes met. She crossed the room without hesitating, pulling off her coat as she walked, and stopped at his table. She was maybe 45, with dark hair still damp at the edges and the look of someone who had been running. Not panicked, but purposeful, like she had been running toward something rather than away. "You're Neil," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," he said. "I'm Colette Marchand. I'm so sorry. I'm your date." She sat down, draped her coat over the back of the chair, and immediately started explaining, not in the apologetic, overly elaborate way of someone making excuses, but in the direct, almost matter-of-fact way of someone reporting what had actually happened, because the facts were sufficient. There had been a woman in the parking garage, older, maybe 70, sitting on the floor beside her car with her hand pressed to her chest. Colette had stopped. She had stayed with the woman. Her name was John. She lived in Barrie. She had driven down to see her granddaughter's school play and thought the tightness in her chest was just anxiety until the paramedics arrived. That had taken 22 minutes. She had called the restaurant from the parking garage and left a message. She had texted Janet. She had, at one point, considered simply not coming at all because she was wet and slightly shaken, and she had already been nervous about tonight before any of this happened. "But I said I would be here," Colette said, "and I don't like breaking that kind of promise." Neil looked at her for a moment. "Is she all right?" he said. "The woman in the parking garage." Colette paused, as though that had not been the first question she expected. "They think so. She was stable when they took her. I got her daughter's number from her phone. She'd already called ahead." "Good," Neil said. Then, "Do you want some bread? I haven't touched it." She laughed, a short, real laugh, not a polished one, and reached for a piece. The restaurant had that particular warmth that February restaurants in Ontario always seem to have, something slightly overcorrected, the radiators doing too much work, the candles adding their small portions of light to the general effort of keeping winter outside. They ordered. The conversation started the way first conversations always do, with the careful, gentle exchange of basic facts. Where she worked, a landscape architecture firm in Barrie, mostly residential projects but some conservation work. Where she lived, a house in Collingwood she had bought 3 years ago and was renovating slowly, one room at a time. Whether she had children, she had one daughter, Maisie, 14, which Colette described as an age that requires strategic patience. Neil had one daughter too, Becca, 26, who worked for a veterinary clinic in Guelph and called him every Sunday at 8 in the morning, without fail. "Every Sunday?" Colette said. 8 o'clock, Neil said, without fail. I think she worries. Does she have reason to? He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. Probably not anymore, he said. For a while she did. He didn't elaborate on that, and Colette didn't push. There was a quality to her attention, steady, unhurried, that made the silences feel like pauses rather than gaps. He found himself telling her about the land trust anyway. Not to impress her, he never told it that way, but because she asked about his work with genuine curiosity, and the work was genuinely what he cared about most in the world after Becca. He told her about the parcel of boreal forest they were trying to protect up near Algonquin's edge, the negotiations with a forestry company that had been going on for 8 months, the moment 2 springs ago when he had walked into a stand of old-growth white pine that shouldn't have still been there, that no one had logged because no one had quite gotten around to it, and had stood in it for almost an hour without moving. 8 months of negotiating, Colette said, for a forest that's been standing for 200 years, 240, some of those trees. She shook her head slightly, not in dismissal but in the kind of quiet awe that people sometimes mistake for disbelief. That's the strangest part of landscape work, she said. How we're always the newest thing in the picture. He looked at her. He had not expected that. He had not expected any of this, if he was being honest, had not expected to sit across from someone and feel the particular sensation of a conversation, moving at exactly the right speed, not rushing toward anything, not stalling either. He had spent 3 years being careful about this feeling. He had learned to distrust it, or at least to hold it at arm's length, until he was sure it was what he thought it was. But sitting there with the sleet against the windows and the bread basket between them and Colette Marchand, talking about the way old forests change the quality of light beneath them, he thought that Marianne would have liked her. That was not a thought he had often. That was not a thought he had ever had before, about anyone. He didn't say it out loud. They stayed until the restaurant was half empty. When the server came to ask about dessert, Neil said he was fine, and Colette said she didn't usually, and they both said the same word at the same time, coffee, and both noticed, and neither made too much of it. At 9:45, Colette looked at her phone and said that her daughter was texting. Nothing urgent. Maisie wanted to know if they had almond milk, which they did not, and this was apparently significant, but it reminded her that she had driven down from Collingwood, and it was not a short drive in this weather. Neil paid the bill before she could reach for her wallet, not with any show of it, just quietly, when the server came the way he handled most things. They stood outside under the restaurant's small awning. The sleet had gentled into something that couldn't quite decide if it was rain or snow. The street was quiet. The parking lot across the way held a few remaining cars, and somewhere in its lower level was a woman named Jean who had maybe dodged something serious tonight, and who was probably home by now, or close to it. "Thank you," Colette said. "I know it was a strange evening. I've had stranger," Neil said, "though I can't recall one I've liked better." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something careful and slightly surprised, the look of someone who had expected something and received something else and wasn't yet sure what to make of the difference. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "If you would." "I would," she said, simply, without equivocation. It was a quality he had noticed throughout the evening. She said what she meant, and she said it clearly, and she did not seem to need to soften every edge of a statement to make it safe. She drove north, he drove south. The truck's heater worked perfectly well despite the cracked dashboard. The second time they met was not a date, exactly. It started as something more practical. Colette had mentioned at some point during that first dinner that she was working on a pro bono project, a small wetland restoration near Wasaga Beach, partnering with a local indigenous-led conservation group that had been trying to get traction on the site for almost a decade. They needed someone with experience navigating conservation agreements, specifically the provincial side of things. Neil had mentioned offhandedly that he knew that process well. She had not taken him up on it immediately. He had not expected her to. But 6 days later she sent a brief email, professional, appropriately formal, without any of the strange performative friendliness that emails between people who have recently had dinner sometimes acquire, asking if he would be willing to have a call about the project. They had the call, then another. Then she drove down to his office in Huntsville on a Thursday morning, and he showed her the existing agreement templates, and they spent 3 hours working through the legal framework for a site covenant. And at 12:30, he said there was a diner 2 streets over that made a fish chowder worth going out of your way for, and she said she would take his word for it. The diner was called Pearlie's. It had been there since 1974 and decorated accordingly. They sat in a corner booth and she ordered the chowder and said that he had not overstated its case. He had the same thing he always ordered: coffee and the grilled cheese, which Becca considered an embarrassing lunch choice for a grown man and which he had no intention of changing. "Does your daughter know you're doing work with me?" Colette asked. "She knows I'm helping with a wetland project," he said. "She probably assumes I'm doing it for free, which is accurate. And does she know anything about the person you had dinner with last week?" He looked at the table briefly. "She'll ask on Sunday." Colette smiled at that. Not the polished version, but the real one, the one that changed her whole face slightly. "And what will you tell her?" "The truth," he said. "Approximately." What he told Becca on Sunday at 8 o'clock was that he had met someone, that she was a landscape architect in Collingwood, that she had been late to their first meeting because she had stopped to help a stranger in a parking garage, that they had talked about forests and daughters and old-growth pine, and that he had liked her very much. Becca was quiet on the phone for a moment that was slightly longer than her usual pauses. "Dad," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I'm not." She stopped. Started again. "I'm glad. I think I'm glad." "You don't have to decide immediately," he said. "No, another pause. Tell me about her." He did. He told her about Colette's work and Colette's project and the way Colette talked about old trees. He did not tell Becca that he had thought, in the restaurant, that Marianne would have liked her. That was too much for a Sunday morning phone call. That might be too much for any phone call. But he held it quietly, the way he held most things that mattered. Becca asked 3 careful questions. At the end, she said, "When do I get to meet her?" He hadn't expected that question yet. He probably should have. "I'll ask her," he said. The months move the way months do when something good is happening slowly. Not slowly enough to be frustrating, but slowly enough to be real. They saw each other every 10 days or so, fitting meetings and phone calls around the particular logistical puzzle of 2 people in their 50s who each had full lives already built. He drove up to Collingwood. She drove down to Huntsville. They walked the property at Wasaga Beach together twice, standing in the half-frozen sedge grass and talking about what the site might look like in 20 years if the work went well. He met Maisie in April. He had thought about this more than he had admitted, not in an anxious way. He was not, by nature, an anxious man, but in the careful, deliberate way he approached anything that mattered. He had known that this meeting would be the one that determined whether what he and Colette had been building between them had anywhere left to go. Colette had told him, in her direct way, that Maisie was smart and perceptive and occasionally difficult, and that she had been 10 years old when her father moved out and had spent 4 years developing a finely calibrated sense of when adults were performing versus when they were being real. He had thought about that. He had decided the only useful response was to be exactly what he was. It was a Saturday. Colette made dinner, something with fish, which Maisie had requested, and roasted potatoes that filled the kitchen with a smell Neil associated immediately with his grandmother's house in Timmins. Maisie sat across from him and assessed him with the frank, evaluative gaze of a teenager who has decided that politeness is optional. "My mom said you have a forest," she said. "Several, technically," he said. "But one that nobody can cut down anymore. That's the goal," he said. She considered this. "How do you make money if you're giving forests away?" He looked at her. "That's a good question." He gave her the actual answer, not the simplified version, but the real one. And she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which he found, privately, impressive. Then she asked a follow-up question about carbon credits that was better than the questions he sometimes got from people with relevant degrees. After dinner, she went upstairs to finish homework, and Colette washed dishes while Neil dried, and neither of them said anything for a few minutes because neither of them needed to. "She liked you," Colette said finally, quietly. "You think so?" She asked you a real question. Colette glanced at him sideways. She doesn't do that with people she's already written off. He thought about that later, driving home through the green April dark, with the windows cracked because spring had finally stopped being tentative. He thought about the fish dinner and the roasted potatoes and the kitchen that smelled like Timmins. He thought about a 14-year-old who asked real questions and a woman who said what she meant, and an old-growth forest that had been quietly surviving for 240 years, because no one had quite gotten around to cutting it down. He thought, some things are only what they are because they were left alone to become it. Becca drove up to Collingwood on a weekend in early June. Neil had arranged it carefully, not engineered it, because he didn't work that way, but arranged it. He had asked both of them separately, given both of them the same honest account of what to expect, and then he had stepped back and let the afternoon go however it went. It went well, and then it went better than well, and then it surprised him entirely. He had been standing on Colette's back deck, watching the garden that was still half finished, still becoming what Colette had imagined it might be, when he heard Becca laugh inside the kitchen. A real laugh, the one that started in her chest, and then he heard Maisie's voice saying something he couldn't quite catch, and then both of them laughing. He stood on the deck and felt something shift in him. Not dramatically, not like something breaking or something snapping into place, more like the way a landscape looks different after the fog burns off. The same geography, all of it, but suddenly visible in a way it hadn't been a moment ago. He heard the back door open behind him. Colette came to stand beside him, close enough that their arms touched, looking out at the same unfinished garden. "They're getting along," he said. "I know," she said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you all right?" He thought about the question seriously, the way she always invited him to. "Yes," he said. "More than all right." He paused. "I want to say something." "Then say it." He turned to look at her. The afternoon light in June in Collingwood has a particular quality, long and low and generous, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you, just offers itself. She was looking at him with the same steady attention she always had, that quality of patience that was not waiting but simply present. "I haven't been in any hurry," he said, "with anything. My whole life I've worked that way. Let things become what they are before you decide what to do with them. And I know it's been 6 months, and 6 months is not." "Neil," she said gently. He stopped. "I know," she said. He looked at her. She meant it, not as shorthand, not as a way of stopping him, but as a genuine statement. She knew she had been carrying the same thing he understood in her own particular way. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded once. It was enough. More than enough. Inside, Becca was still talking to Maisie, and through the kitchen window he could see Becca gesturing enthusiastically about something, and Maisie listening with an expression that she probably thought was reserved. And that was, in fact, fascinated. He asked her on an evening in late October on the property at Wasaga Beach. The site covenant had been registered in August. The wetland was already showing the early signs of what Colette had known it could become. The sedge grass thicker at the margins, the water clearer, a pair of sandhill cranes that someone from the indigenous-led group had photographed in September, where no one had seen cranes in 12 years. They had driven out there together, the way they had twice in the winter, but this time the light was October amber, and the air smelled of cold grass and lake water, and the particular mineral smell of soil that is slowly remembering how to be healthy. They were standing at the edge of the restored channel when he said her name. She looked at him. He didn't have a speech. He had thought about speeches, briefly, in the way he thought about many things, and had decided they were not the right form for what he wanted to say, which was something true and specific rather than something beautiful and general. "I'm not who I was 3 years ago," he said, "and I'm not who I was a year ago either. I don't know exactly who I'm becoming, but I know I want to become it with you. I want Becca to have you. I want to be someone Maisie can trust. I want to grow old next to a person who asks real questions and means what she says." He reached into his jacket pocket. "This was my grandmother's," he said, "from Timmins. She was a plain woman and she had plain taste, and I always liked that about her. It was a simple gold band with a small pale stone, white sapphire, old cut, that caught the October light and held it." Colette looked at the ring, then at him. "Neil Hartwell," she said. "Colette Marchand," he said. Her eyes were bright with something as it was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and was, perhaps, the thing that happens when you have held on to hope for a long time, and then, without warning, find that you don't have to hold it quite so tightly anymore. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which felt like a small, sufficient miracle. They stood there in the October marsh, with the cranes somewhere overhead, and the channel running clear and quiet beside them, and the whole long, complicated fact of being alive. The losses in it, the silences in it, the years spent keeping things together, and the years spent letting things simply be. Settled around them like the light settled over the water, without drama, without announcement, as if it had always been exactly this.